Hello. What I'd like to do today is talk about or create a context for looking at when organisations need to change and how we can predict change. The tool to do this has been developed by Dr. Tony Miller, who is an acknowledged expert in organisational change, where organisations need to be more effective. His model is basically made up of 3 stages. One is called formative, one is called normative, and one is called integrative. These stages are representative of an organisation's lifeline. Some organisations go through these stages in 20 to 30 years. Others, such as eBay, go through these 3 stages in a matter of months. The model specifically looks at the productivity of the organisation over time, and what I would like to do is explain each of these phases individually, starting with Phase 1. Phase 1 is when the organisation is at its beginning stage. It's when somebody has an idea, and that idea is being shared with others that sort of have a common vision of what could be. It's a time at which we ask the question, what? What is going to be our product? What is going to be our service? What is the way we're going to organise ourselves in regards to working? The group is about creating a future where everyone is a stakeholder in the process. There's no issue regarding energy because everyone is the stakeholder. It's as though if they succeed, they all succeed. If they fail, they all fail. And so they're all highly motivated to make something happen. They have a very strong leader orientation. They have someone who has a clear vision or an idea that has engaged them in the process, and they're eager to determine how they can make that vision come true. In regard to thinking, it's a very inventive time within the organisation. Everything is about learning the best way to proceed. It's a time at which risk-taking is endorsed. They learn by trial and error. It's a time at which there's a very strong future focus. And so somebody is holding a vision about what the potential is. Have they got the product or the service to market? Many groups never get out of Phase 1 because they fail to secure a marketplace. Usually, in Phase 1, a group is financed either by a third-party resource or themselves, and they fail to be successful in Phase 2 unless they secure a market for their product or service. It changes from a very inventive type of atmosphere to one of moving towards a set of standards and controls in which we begin to ask the question, how do we replicate our product in as efficient a manner as possible? With regard to working, the group is about getting organised. Organisation requires becoming or creating a structure. It requires creative procedures and processes by which we are to operate. So you see the emergence of things like the policy manual, formality, and how people communicate. I always say that an organisation moves to Phase 2 when you see communication emerge as meetings or in the form of emails, as a way people communicate to each other. It's a time at which we put a tremendous amount of energy into replication, into repeating the processes as a way of reducing the cost. Repeating the processes is a way of speeding up how we in fact deliver our product and service. It's a time at which everything becomes much more formal. It's the emergence of the hierarchy within the organisation. It's a time at which we institute a formal management system, and this system begins to divide the concept of the whole and the parts to which we apply controls, and it's at this point where we begin to lose a little bit of the energy of the people because they are no longer stakeholders in the whole. They become stakeholders in that part of the business which they have been held responsible for. And often the concept of stakeholding is replaced by stockholders. And part of your employee ranks becomes to simply work to meet goals and targets. With regards to thinking, it becomes a time at which much thinking is efficiency orientated. the management of routines. And it's about know-how, knowing how to do a certain type of job. We begin to engineer risk out of the process, rather than use risk as a form of learning. And that future focus that we had in phase one is often replaced by a sense of end of the month. What do we look like? And how do we message our progress at the end of the month? Also, at phase two, it's a time at which the leader often leaves the organisation, the vision area. That person is often replaced by someone who has an operations orientation. The original leader often goes back into a phase one type orientation because that's where they feel most comfortable. And so it is a time at which the organisation often experiences its first crisis, and that is the crisis of leadership. The person who brought them to the existence as an organisation has now left. That person has been replaced by someone who really operates as the head of the organisation from a financial perspective. And for a lot of people who were part of phase one, this is a very difficult transition. Mid-phase two happens within organisations perhaps 10 to 15 years later in many cases. The organisation now is about perfecting the how. They've been in a steady growth rate for a significant period of time. They're working often to occupy a market segment, to keep that segment healthy. They steadily increase the sense of having functional focus, and so groups work independently of each other as individuals. They're becoming what is referred to as the institution. This is what I consider some of the qualities of an institution to be. We start to see the beginnings of embedded management, and that embedded management is best expressed as the way they start to think about things. For example, from a sense of efficiency, they perhaps become so efficient in regard to their products or their procedures or their services that now they sort of up the stake. And they begin to look at the entire structure of the organisation, and so they begin what's called the restructuring or reorganising pattern. If you look at the lifeline of an organisation, say a 20-year lifeline, in the first 10 years, many organisations perhaps restructure once or twice, and in the next 5 years, they probably restructure or are reorganised 3 or 4 more times. And in the last 5 years, they tend to be restructuring or reorganising every year, and in some situations even more than that. It seems as though when an organisation gets into a restructuring kind of mentality, it's extremely difficult to get out of it. It was as though when a problem came up, the solution became, let's restructure, let's reorganise. And there were a couple of consequences to that. One was that a lot of people who didn't like one particular type of reorganisation would keep their heads down and hope the next reorganisation would be better for them. In a sense, they were using their energies to remain undiscovered. A second consequence of a restructuring was basically the fact that it seemed to become the solution to almost every problem. It's been said, if the only tool I have is a hammer, then everything looks like nails. And that's the sort of organisational mentality that begins to surface. The restructuring is more about tinkering with the structure rather than a full downsizing or right-sizing operation. It's also a time at which some embedded concept of management creates a type of thinking that creates what's referred to as heroic managers. And let me give you a few examples of the way a heroic manager would think. One is that the heroic manager believes that they should know more than all the people who work for them, so that they're the know-how or the knowledge people. And often they will purposely hire people that know less as a way to sort of capture that belief that they're supposed to know more. And if they're the knowledge holders, the question becomes, how are they in fact using their own people? And so, usually mid-phase 2, you have a sense of heroism around knowledge, around problem solving, around responsibility, and that creates a vacuum for which the employees are supposed to be responsible. This works well unless the organisation moves into a period of transition or significant change. Then, all of a sudden, we have an environment that's really underutilised in terms of how it should respond to the organisation's need to change, so that these patterns of held belief become the very reason why it's difficult for organisations to change. This was the case with Nissan prior to the arrival of Carlos Ghosn, who had to fundamentally change the way managers worked. Where organisations excel is when they have created a shared responsibility environment. And when they can create that, it's a very positive step in terms of the way the organisation functions. Google is the best model of where this operates. Mid-phase 2 is often the time in which the organisation really becomes an institution. Its experience has seen relative growth over a significant period of time, growth to the point where people begin to think that it's going to go on forever, and they experience relative stability over that period of time, with change only occurring as refinement. It has created a strong hierarchy, functionalisation, which makes it very difficult for the organisation to cooperate with itself. Often, departments have become silos within the organisation, each silo operating independently and sometimes to the detriment of the organisation as a whole. It has had a tradition of dealing with technical issues more than people issues, and much of how it has looked at itself has been predictable. It perhaps at this point begins to experience a different kind of crisis. One of red tape, one in which we become extremely procedure-bound and thinking-bound, and it puts us in a dangerous position if at some point we're required to change quickly. Late phase 2 is that point in an organisation's life where if they can look out far enough and be strategic, they will see that growth is ending. In fact, if they look far enough out, it might even be declining. The characteristically long period of profit is now ending, and there may be good reason for this. One is that cost is increasing. By nature, the institution spends too much money, and it hires too many people. And along with that, we might see an increase in competition. There's perhaps new players in the marketplace. We see the organisation begin to get into what is called procedure binds. Many of the procedures that were so effective in phase 2 now become controls. Many of the systems that were instituted to measure profits, to respond to customers, are not working like they used to. A lot of the acquisitions, perhaps made in mid-phase 2, are now failing, and we might just see natural market shifts occurring. All of this leads to a sense of decline, and it often calls for the organisation to take upon itself 3 major strategies. One is internal, to deal with systems issues. The second is to try to extend, for as long as possible, that lifeline that they've been experiencing. And the third choice is often to change things to make it work. It's a very difficult period for the organisation because these 3 strategies tend to occur at the same time. We are dealing with systems issues. We're trying to extend out the organisation as it is, and somebody's probably trying to transition the organisation or redefine it. It's a very difficult time. Morale often becomes an issue. It's extremely hard on people, especially with the phase 1 experience, and you're likely to see several false starts in the process. The most natural thing organisations do is like phase 2. They try to extend out what they're already doing. They do that by continuing to restructure. They tend to extend phase 2 by cutting costs and cutting people. And as a result of cutting costs and cutting people, you'll often hear the organisation talk about having to work harder rather than be different. There was lots of evidence of this during the financial crisis in 2012. And there will often be a back to basics push, where a certain number of people will express a desire to go back to when things were simple, when we were only focusing on certain products and certain services. And why did we ever get off on all these acquisitions anyway? And so there is this back to basics type of thinking. The organisation often sells off marginal businesses at this point as a way of raising cash. A lot of organisations at this point do nothing, hoping that things will sort themselves out. And this has caught out more than a few companies. Dixon's in the UK and the universal giant Kodak are both examples where they failed to sense the change and act quickly enough. Another thing organisations can do, which is critical at late phase 2, is to renew themselves, to begin to think that simply extending out phase 2 is not the solution, but that we've got to start, as an organisation, to think differently and to go into an integrative or transitional state to sort of redefine or renew the business. And this is called phase 3. Microsoft has been the master at doing this. The integrative stage is when the organisation places itself in transition, and this influences significantly how people are asked to work, how they're asked to think, and what's required of their training. With regards to working, all of a sudden people are working in a changing environment, and they're being asked to recreate or reinvent what the organisation is. They're being asked to recall the attributes of phase 1, being stakeholders, sharing in the process, sharing in the vision, helping to break down the barriers of an institution that has actually created many of the problems they're now experiencing. A dilemma occurs at this point because while we need the energies of the people, they're often in survival mode. Because we've had to cut costs and cut people in the process, the thinking is around what needs to change to make this a much better organisation. Thinking needs to change from one of efficiency, the management of routines, to one of effectiveness, the management of strategy. We need to reintroduce the concept of willingness to take risk and to create a sense of a learning environment. We have to think of ourselves as being part of a competitive environment in which we are about trying to succeed and becoming more successful. We need to think more like leaders and less like managers, because one thing we know is you can't manage people through change. You must lead them. This is a time for a great leader to emerge and for putting the 6 key leadership skills into practice. Dr. Miller's organisational questionnaire enables you to see with some certainty when any organisation is approaching mid-stage 2, and then change can be planned for in an orderly and timely way. The formula for calculating organisational right-sizing can then be used with great effect. This is the time when business process re-engineering will produce its maximum benefit. This change will produce results of efficiency and effectiveness in private and public sectors. In conclusion, the tools developed by Dr. T have given us the ability to see and plan for change. The Organisational Maturity System Questionnaire works best when it is completed by the line managers. They are then party to the identification of the problem and therefore can be instrumental in providing the solution. The world financial crisis has given us a wake-up call. We all need to be vigilant and to run organisations effectively. We have the tools now to make this happen. The questionnaire and software are available from our website www.tony-miller.com. Thank you for your attention.